everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's video we are going to be reviewing my master's degree. So I've dressed very appropriately in my University of Edinburgh hoodie that I've had for a couple years and my skelly socks, which I thought were quite appropriate for today's content of my video, where we are going to be talking about my time in 2013-14 when I moved to Edinburgh to study at the University of Edinburgh for a Master's of Science in Human Osteoarchaeology. I would definitely say that this ended up being one of the most life-changing years I've ever had for a variety of reasons. One, I moved across an ocean to a completely different country where I had no family, no friends, one person that I knew already, and after my mom left, I was on my own. I ended up living on my own for the first time ever because I chose to rent an apartment instead of going into student housing, which was an experience in and of itself. I obviously went and studied and got a master's degree, which is a continuation of my education. And it's also during this year that I met and started dating my partner. We are now engaged to be married. So yeah, overall, I would say that quite a few significant things in my life happened this year in and outside of school. A lot of people might be wondering why I decided to do this, and there's quite a few different reasons behind it. I kind of knew by the end of my undergraduate degree that I wanted to pursue a postgraduate qualification. In my mind, it would better prepare me for the job market, having that extra qualification. I decided to go to the UK because they did their master's programs usually within 1 year, whereas Canada, they typically take 2 years, and I wanted to get the qualification and enter into the job market as soon as possible, so that seemed better for me. I wanted to get out of my hometown because that's where I had studied for my undergraduate degree, and I was kind of ready for something new. I had visited Scotland when I was maybe 10 or 11, I don't really know how old, and I had come away with it with an impression of Scotland and what it was like that I can't necessarily say was accurate, but it left me really wanting to go back there. So when I was researching programs, the University of Edinburgh happened to have a program in human osteoarchaeology, which I felt suited me perfectly because I definitely wanted to study human specimens instead of animal specimens, and I wanted the focus to be on osteoarchaeology instead of perhaps like forensics. I specifically wanted to have something that was still related to the archaeology field. So all of the things combined, I applied for the program, I was accepted to the program, and like I said, in August of 2013, I moved there a couple weeks before it started in order to set myself up. One big difference between this video and my undergraduate videos is that unlike my undergraduate videos, I actually still have all of my material for my master's degree here in Edinburgh in my flat, whereas everything for my undergraduate is at my parents' house in Canada. So we're gonna have a bit more material to look at and show you today. Now, in order to obtain the degree, I had to pass 6 courses and write a dissertation. The courses were split, so you took 3 in the fall and 3 in the winter semesters, and then your dissertation was written over the course of the summer. So the entire thing actually took a year. It wasn't just, you know, the typical academic year and then you have the summer off. I wanted to record my dissertation within this video, but when I was kind of working everything out, it just was going to end up being way too long, and dissertations themselves are like a completely different beast. So this way I can go through it and the process of writing it in a bit more depth for you guys than I would if I was in this video where I would kind of just skim over it. The first semester in the fall started in September, and a lot of these courses were what I kind of think of like, they're kind of like the practical beginner courses. A lot of people ask me about things that they can do to prepare for degrees or master's programs, and I mean, most of the time you don't have to do a lot. As you will see from my courses for the fall semester, they did not expect us to come in with any prior knowledge of the subject. You obviously had to have a bit of a passion for it, a reason why you wanted to study that in order to get accepted, but they certainly didn't expect you to already come in with a bunch of knowledge, especially since they don't know the quality of that, where it comes from, what you were already taught. So instead of accounting and trying to accommodate what everyone's different knowledge levels were, they just decided to get back to basics and start at the beginning. So the first course that we took was human musculoskeletal anatomy, because obviously in order to study skeletons, you need to be able to identify them and identify what parts of them you're looking at. I think we had 2 possibly 3 lectures a week. I can't really remember exactly when we had these lectures, but we would have lectures throughout the week, and then the following Monday we would have a bell ringer test on all the previous material that we had covered. So if you haven't watched my previous video about my 3rd year where I discussed my anatomy course I did at my undergrad, a bell ringer test is where you have stations set up through a room, each with specimens that you will have to answer questions on. You get maybe 1 or 2 minutes to examine the specimen, answer the question on your sheet, and then a bell rings and you have to move on to the next station. You can't go back to any station that you might have missed. You only have that one space of time to do it. And if you don't know the answer to that specific question at that station in the space of time that you're given, you have to leave it blank and you don't get the mark. Some people really dislike these tests, and I will say that when I started doing them in my undergrad, I kind of struggled with them a bit, but being familiar with them, I was a bit more confident going into my master's program, and I didn't struggle nearly as much as I had before, or maybe as much as some people who had never experienced that type of testing before. And we had a test every week, so there ended up being 9, and I have them all here. These are all of my quizzes from my bell ringer test. So I'm not going to show you the specific test. I'm going to read out a couple of these questions. These tests covered the entirety of what we'd already learned. So it wasn't just like, oh, we learned all about the torso this week, and next week's test is about the torso. And then the week after that, we learn about the legs. The test after that would be about the torso and the legs. It just added things on every test, so they would progressively get more and more difficult as you have more and more stuff that you have to memorize. So an example of the questions that you have on here, the first one on this test is identify. So you would have had a bone on a station, so on like a piece of foam on a desk. You can pick it up, you can look at it, and in this case it was a sacrum, which is part of your pelvis. So beyond basic identification, like what is this bone and what is this part of this bone, they would also ask you questions like what structure passes through what this arrow is pointing to. So that's in reference to muscles or ligaments. You'd also get asked what articulates to this feature, what articulates this bone, what end of the bone is what you're seeing here, what attaches to this area. Since I'd already done an anatomy course, the first couple tests for this were easy for me, but as they went on, they became more difficult, especially for me, and I think for a lot of the other people in my class once we got to the teeth. Teeth are just a headache and a half, and with teeth you're having to not only identify right side or left side, you have to identify if it's upper or lower jaw, is it your first or second incisor, is it your first, second, or third molar, the first or second premolar, if the teeth are deciduous or permanent. There's just a lot of extra criteria when it comes to teeth that you have to identify. We covered both the skeleton and the muscles, so we had to know all the bones in the body, and then we also went over all the different muscles that were attached to them, etc. I did want to show you something that kind of helped me with my memorization of this, and so this is kind of my master's coloring book, so to speak. I'll take the pages out, but as you can see, what I did for almost all the different bits that we were expected to memorize was I printed out the anatomical drawings of it, and then I would color in on each piece where the different muscles attached. Here, these are the scapula, which is your shoulder blade, in case you didn't already know. So I've got the front and the back of it here because obviously different muscles attach to the front and the back. And I have all of the different bits colored in, outlined, and then labeled with the muscle that attaches there. And just this act of kind of coloring this in and then looking this over really helped me when I was studying, so maybe doing something similar can help you. So the next class within this semester was Analytical Methods in Human Osteoarchaeology. Again, this was more of a refresher rather than some completely new material for me. This course was about principles and techniques that you use to interpret data about skeletal material, which is stuff that I had done previously. It covered a lot of the stuff within the Bwickstra and Ubelager standards. So you're looking at determining things like age, sex, stature, as well as looking about other factors like taphonomy, pathology. We had lectures on radiocarbon dating and stable isotope analysis. We also talked a little bit about the ethics, because obviously you are studying the remains of a human being. What are the ethics involved in that? What things do you need to make sure that you're conscious of when you're doing this? So this course was very text-based. So we were reading and learning about these methods, and then we were tested on them, and then we also had to write an essay. So I don't seem to have the actual essay anymore. I just have my grading page about it, and I did okay on it, but I don't really remember much else about it. The thing I remember about this class was the final test, and this is probably one of the things I'm most bitter about from my master's course, because I ended up with a much smaller grade than I should have because of a screw up within the department. And I'm not trying to blame a specific person, but basically the situation was we went into this test and there was a couple different questions on it that when I was writing it, I was just like, I do not remember covering this in class. Like, this does not ring any bells for me. And for at least one of them, I put down a joke answer. I was just annoyed and I was just like, "Ugh, whatever, I'll just write something down and I'll just make it up," which was retrospectively stupid. There was a question about half-life and DNA, and my answer, jokingly, was 42, the answer to life, the universe, and everything, which is from the famous Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. There's a couple more questions that I didn't know the answer to, but I attempted to answer them, but I hadn't really studied for them because they hadn't been in our material, and like I had studied well. If I look at the rest of my test on this, I was doing quite well until I got to the questions that weren't covered in our course. I ended the exam and we all left the room and we went up to the post-grad lounge after, where everyone was kind of debriefing. And it turned out that I wasn't the only person that was going, WTF, what are these questions on the exam? So we ended up as a class bringing up these concerns to our professors. And it turns out that one of the people who had contributed questions to the exam had accidentally given us the questions from last year where they had delivered a different lecture. So the content hadn't been the same as what we had gotten, and she'd given us questions for content that we had never covered. Because of that, they basically said, all right, well, we'll strike all those questions off the exam and recalculate the total, except for if you actually answered the question. So everyone who had left those answers blank got the answers struck off from their final total for the exam and ended up with a better grade because it was more fairly graded. But people who did answer the questions actually got marked on what the answer was, which I personally don't think was fair because I was guessing. I was still making an attempt, with the exception of my one joke answer, to answer the question. I got penalized for that, even though I was trying my hardest to make sure that I was answering as many questions on the exam as possible. So that still ticks me off to this day that that's how they did it. They should have just said everyone's getting those answers stricken off their exam rather than only the people who left it blank, but it's fine, whatever. It was like over 5 years ago. Still sits with me and I'm still salty about it. My last class for the fall semester was Practical Osteology, which is a course that is no longer offered as a part of this degree at the University of Edinburgh. So it's been about 6 years since I did this program. They've made some changes to it. This course is no longer available. I think it's actually been replaced with a stats course, which arguably is probably better because it teaches you how to use R and statistics. It's a bit more useful in the wider world. This course is a bit of a partner to the analytical methods course, because within this one you were taking what you kind of learned about in the analytics course about determining sex, stature, age, etc., and actually applying it in this course. So this was, rather than being heavily classroom and lecture based, this was very much a lab-based course, and the way it ran was that everybody came in once or twice a week. We would get a skeleton specimen to look at, and we would have to start using these methods that we learned about in class on the skeleton, and this culminated in a paper that we had to write that was a skeletal report. We got assigned a specific skeleton and we had to determine all of these things about it. I did pretty well on this report. So the things that I talked about within it were things that we already know about the site where it was coming from, the condition that it was in. It would seem that the skeleton I had ended up being a male who was between 35 and 50 when he died, and between 162 and 168 centimeters tall, which is obviously quite a bit of variation, but I mean, stature itself is not an exact science anyway. And so this paper was filled with quite a lot of charts and appendices to support all of my grading and everything. And it wasn't particularly hard for me to write because I had already done a lot of these methods both in the field while I was in Jordan and during my other osteology courses that I took in my undergrad. So luckily that helped me get a good grade in this course. So once we finished our first semester, we then moved on to the winter semester, and these courses went from being very practical, lab-based, kind of getting a hold of the basic stuff, to being a lot more cerebral. There was a lot more about methodologies, discussing stuff, a lot less based in the lab. So the first course that we're going to talk about that I took for the second semester was skeletal pathology. So pathology, and this is the study of how disease and trauma affects your skeletal system and what it can tell us as researchers when we look at the skeleton after someone's passed away. This class was a bit more of a mix between lab and lecture, similar to the analytical methods and practical osteology courses, but combined into one. So we would learn about certain types of pathologies, and then we would also have a lab portion where they would show us skeletal material with this stuff on it. So we were looking at stuff like skeletal lesions, different kinds of trauma and different like breaks, how things have healed, how different diseases affect the skeleton, and what's quite diagnostic, something like like syphilis, or what is stuff that's kind of a bit more generic where you can say this person suffered from a disease, but I don't exactly know what. And this is how we usually are able to determine how someone died. That being said, it doesn't happen all the time because quite a few people die from things that kill them so quickly it doesn't have time to affect their skeletal system when it comes to diseases. So for example, things like the plague, besides the fact that they might be in a like plague mass grave, there really doesn't tend to be a lot of signs on the skeletal system that is what that person died from because it killed so quickly. So your skeleton is a living structure that is constantly remodeling itself, and a disease needs to be present in your body for a certain amount of time before it will affect your skeleton in a way that we can see a couple hundred years after you die. We had at least one guest lecturer from Simon Mays from the University of Southampton for this course, which was quite cool. He's a really well-known pathological researcher. It was great to get a lecture from him during this course. Similar to the practical osteology class, the assessment for this class was entirely based upon a skeletal report that we had to write on a specific skeleton, and it ended up being the same one that we had to write our practical osteo report on. So this skeleton would have specifically been chosen because they have pathology that you can look at and diagnose. What we had to do for this report was identify each bit. We had to take decent photos for our report with scales and everything in order to include them and be able to demonstrate what we are actually talking about. I did well, and there is a comment on it that had good supporting photographs and appendices, so quite happy with that. Next we have bioarchaeological interpretation, and the focus of this course was about the analysis and interpretation methods that we use for archaeology, specifically on individuals and populations. Instead of being either a lecture or lab-based, it was a seminar. So there was a much smaller class size than the rest of my classes so far. I think there was maybe 10 of us. We would have readings every week, we'd have a presentation every week, and we'd have discussion every week. The way it was structured was that there was initially a presentation by our professor in the first week, but then after that, we got grouped together, and each week a group of students had to present a PowerPoint on a specific topic and then lead discussion on that topic for the rest of the seminar. So you had to prepare like lead-in questions and etc. in addition to just making this PowerPoint. Honestly, I don't even remember what my PowerPoint was on for this class. I do remember a couple things about this class, one of which is our discussion of something that's called the osteological paradox. So a lot of interesting discussions and ideas that we came up with this class, and definitely not one of those classes where if you're a shy person, you can just kind of like sit back and not participate. It's such a small class size. Everyone has to participate at some point, and the professor will notice if you don't want to ever say anything. Last but not least, we had research sources and strategies, which is a kind of a fancy way of saying thesis prep. Also introducing us to what is going to be expected once we finish our master's if we start doing osteological work, so the kind of professional standards and practices that are used when working in osteoarchaeology. It really focused less on like facts and knowledge and more about developing your skills in critical thinking, basic IT, you know, using Excel, Word, etc. Problem solving, developing your writing, making sure you have good time management so that you're not spending days working on something that should only take maybe a single day to do. Just like the bioarchaeological interpretation course, this was very much a seminar course, so it was a smaller class size. It was a lot more about reading stuff, coming to class, having read it, and then discussing what you've read. In terms of coursework, we had to create a poster that then went on display, and we had like an event where we stood by our poster and people could ask us questions about it, and then it got graded on a topic of our choice. I believe from my notebooks that I chose a project that I had already done in my undergrad, the Grave Circle A at Mycenae, because it obviously had skeletal remains in it, so it applied to my course. But I don't have my poster. I think it got kept by the university and probably got thrown out. The other piece of coursework that we had to do for this class was create a research proposal for our dissertations. We had to kind of begin to create what we thought our dissertation was going to be and then make a proposal for it. And I did okay on this. I didn't do amazing. I got a remark on it that I needed to look at the Edinburgh University guidelines for writing a research proposal, which I clearly didn't consult when I was writing this. I did end up doing my dissertation on the content of my research proposal, so it was a good basis for what I was going to do later for my dissertation. All right, so that's all of the courses that I did. Those of you who maybe have done an osteology degree or perhaps interested in it or are involved in the field in some way will have definitely noticed that we didn't actually do any work with cadavers. So depending on where you're studying, you may or may not be required to work with dead bodies that still have flesh on them, which I'm not gonna lie is probably one of the reasons I chose Edinburgh, because I was not interested in that part of learning about human anatomy. So we only worked with skeletons from the skeletal collection at the university. We didn't do anything on anything else. I don't even think the forensics students, because we kind of did a lot of our classes with people who were studying a degree in forensics, and I don't even think they ended up doing anything on cadavers. But like I said, that very much depends on the school that you're going to. I had a friend of mine who did almost the exact same course as me, but at Sheffield, and she ended up working on dead bodies. So she had a partner and they had to go and, you know, cut things or basically dissect this person over the course of one of their modules, which she was, you know, fine with and happy to do. So if you want that experience, definitely make sure that the school you have is either offering or not before you end up going there. As you could see from the courses, there was definitely quite a mix between test and essay. It wasn't just one or the other, and we were also getting graded on presentations, so there was a bit more of an emphasis on like speaking skills and being able to put together a presentation, make your way through it. I will say that the grading system was a bit more of a shock to me coming from Canada. I wasn't really aware of it before I arrived, but in general, the UK tends to mark, I don't know if I'd say harsher, but on a much different scale. So whereas in Canada, I was maybe used to getting higher marks, say in like the 70s and 80s, with occasionally higher or lower. On my master's course, I was more around the 60s and 70s, which I wasn't used to, but it's not because my work necessarily was worse, it's just because they grade much harsher here, and in order to get a high like 80s, 90s grade, you really need to be outstanding. And I think, as I've said before, I've always kind of been an average to good student. I've never been like an excellent, outstanding student. I've always kind of been middle of the pack. So if you are an international student going to a UK university, be aware of that and try not to let it hurt your feelings too much. I'm gonna cover my dissertation in a different video because I'm already going way over what I planned for this one, and I really would like to give my master's dissertation a bit of justice. Overall, to sum up my course, I think the big question that everybody asks with these is, are you happy that you did this, or would you go back and do it again? Was it good value for money? And that is something that I think is a really interesting discussion to be having nowadays as more and more people pursue higher education, because there's definitely this case where it seems like the bar is constantly getting set higher and higher. Certainly with my generation, you know, almost everyone I know went to university, and I would say a sizable portion of my graduating class from my undergraduate went on to get master's postgraduate degrees. and then a sizable portion of that also went on to get PhDs. It just seems like everyone's having to get all of these extra qualifications because they think that's going to help them when it comes to getting a job. And in terms of my master's degree, if you were to ask me if I could go back in time and do it again, would I? It's more of a gray area than a yes or no answer, because like I said, it was a life-changing year for me. I met my partner. I live here in Edinburgh now. You know, I wouldn't have lived here if I hadn't come here to do my master's, and I'm happy with the direction that my life has gone in. But would I go back and do my master's again? In my personal opinion, probably not. This might be a bit controversial. It's for a variety of factors, one of which is definitely the amount of money that it costs to get. As an international student, your fees are absolutely astronomical in comparison to a domestic student. And I'm not saying that that shouldn't be the case, but I'm just saying that it's very expensive and people have to go into a lot of debt in order to pay for this education. And when you do something like that, you expect, or at least I expected, a certain amount of dividends or a return on that investment in my education. And professionally, I haven't seen that. So as I said at the beginning of the video, one of the reasons I decided to get a master's was because I was thinking of pursuing a career in osteology, and I thought, you know, a master's is going to give me an edge without having to commit to like a 4-year PhD. And I didn't see a PhD as necessary because I didn't really want to do academia. Now, as you may have noticed in any of my other videos, I've never worked as an osteologist since I graduated. I've worked on one project where there was skeletal material that I got to work on, but it wasn't as an osteologist, it was as an archaeologist. And the osteology jobs in the UK are very, very far and few between. And to be honest, the osteology master's degree is very, very popular. I would say almost every single major university with an archaeology department in the UK offers this as a course, and they have quite a high level of students taking it. So there's a lot of people that you have to compete against. For example, there was a UK archaeology company that was hiring people to work as osteologists on a major high-speed train project somewhere in the south that shall remain unnamed. And they put out this advert for this job, and I think that they had hundreds of applications for, I want to say maybe about 20 jobs, and none of those jobs were permanent. They were all attached to that project. So in that case, you have to be really dedicated and you really have to stand out from the crowd in order to make that a career for yourself. And even if that's the case, the job just might not be there. In this sense of, if you are trying to get this master's degree because this is what you want to do a job in, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because the likelihood of you getting that job is very slim. And I don't want to be negative or crush people's dreams, but unfortunately that's the reality of the world. You know, that's what I wanted to do, and I've gone in a completely different direction, which I'm also very happy with, but it's not the direction that, you know, in my dream world I would have liked to be able to do. So if I could go back, I would just move to Edinburgh and get a job in an archaeology company and done everything else the same except for taking the master's course. And that's not also to disparage the school or the teachers or the quality of the education. You know, I felt like I did get a good quality education while I was there, but as I said, I don't feel like I got a return for the amount of money that I had to spend. So as some of my colleagues will say to a lot of students, you know, if you want to study this thing because you're interested in it and you want to know more about it, feel free. If you're studying it in order to get a job and for your job prospects, especially a field like osteology, maybe do a little bit more research on what those prospects actually are before you decide to embark on it. That being said, I did love my time at the University of Edinburgh. The university itself is an absolutely beautiful campus. All of my teachers were very helpful, and I got on with them. My particular class that I studied with, you know, we were all great kids. We really bonded together. We would go out. It was useful for me because I didn't know anybody else in the city, so it provided me with a friend group and a support group I otherwise wouldn't necessarily have had. I am still friends and I still regularly speak to people that were on that course with me, and I'll forever look upon that year as one that shaped me in a lot of ways as a person. I think it's kind of that year where I really grew into being an adult by having to live on my own and take care of myself without being able to rely on like my parents. One last interesting tidbit about my time at Edinburgh University is that at some point during our masters, I'm not quite sure when, all the osteo students got sent a email saying that the department was looking to do promotional photos and they needed some of the master's students to volunteer because they were qualified to handle the skeletal material, and these were photos that were going to get used in promotional materials for the program and the university, the website, etc. So with myself being one of those kind of naturally attention-seeking kind of people with an unrealized modeling career, I volunteered to participate and did a day with my one friend. I like did my hair all fancy and did my makeup and everything. I had my cool lab coat on, and we went to the lab and we took a bunch of photos of the two of us, you know, using different tools to measure the skeletons and holding tools up to the skeletons and looking at them and being like, And then later we went into a lecture theater with more people from the rest of the school and had to look really thoughtful as if we were watching a lecture, and they took photos of us. As a result of this, to this day, because I just saw it when I was researching for this video, you can go to the University of Edinburgh website and there are pictures of me just scattered about within it. And I also actually saw them once when I was in the department and I was walking up a stairwell, and there's just these pictures of me in a lecture looking really interested, and we got paid with like some gift certificates to a bookstore with it. But it's just kind of one of my more memorable moments is that I will be haunting the school for a while now with my picture being everywhere. So yeah, secret Easter egg, if you're considering applying for the University of Edinburgh, you might see my face on the webpage. So that's about 2/3 of the material that we've talked about today about me studying for a master's degree in human osteoarchaeology. Next, we'll obviously be talking more about my master's dissertation, how I wrote it, what I wrote it on, processes I went through, etc., etc. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns for me, please put them in the description box below. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you'd like to see anything else from me, check out the rest of my channel and make sure that you subscribe and hit the bell button so that you get notified every single time I put out a video. If you want to follow me on social media, I've put links to my Twitter and my Instagram down below. Thanks so much for watching, you guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye!